Los Angeles was a city of fame and fortune, but also of forgotten people and lost dreams. Every day, thousands walked its streets, eyes fixed on their phones, minds busy with their own lives, never noticing the ones who had been left behind. But Snoop Dogg had always seen things differently. One ordinary afternoon, while cruising through the streets of downtown LA, something made him hit the brakes. Not a flashing billboard, not a crowd of fans, not even a new mural of himself on a building. It was something much simpler, yet far more powerful. A man, sitting on the cold pavement, his hands covered in chalk dust, creating a masterpiece on a sidewalk that the world would never bother to remember. People walked past him like he wasn't even there. But Snoop stopped. And that decision was about to change everything. The streets of downtown Los Angeles never stopped moving. People rushed from one place to another, their minds too occupied to notice what was happening right under their feet. Horns blared, neon signs flickered, the scent of street food mixed with exhaust fumes. It was a city that swallowed you whole if you weren't careful. But amidst the chaos, there was a man, crouched low on the pavement, his fingers stained with chalk dust, his focus unshaken, his hands moving with purpose. His canvas wasn't framed. His art wouldn't be displayed in a gallery. It wouldn't hang in a collector's home. Because it would be gone the moment the first drop of rain hit the sidewalk. And yet, he poured his soul into every line. A city bathed in neon. A sky streaked with shades of purple and gold. The reflection of LA's towering buildings captured in puddles that weren't really there. It was a vision of the same city that had turned its back on him. But he never stopped drawing. Los Angeles was a city that prided itself on knowing everything, seeing everything, broadcasting everything, every new trend, every celebrity sighting, every viral moment that would dominate the internet for a day before being replaced by the next. The city's eyes were everywhere, but somehow, they still managed to miss what was right in front of them. The streets were crowded as always, pedestrians weaving between traffic, heads down, phones up, their attention fixed on their screens instead of the world around them. Conversations blended with the distant sound of car horns and music spilling from passing storefronts, but amid all of that, in the middle of this pulsing, chaotic city, there was something real happening, something that no one noticed. Except for one man. The chalk dust clung to his fingers like the last remnants of a forgotten dream, his hands moving with precision, with purpose, as he brought a city to life on a piece of sidewalk that millions had stepped on, but none had ever truly seen. His work was vibrant, full of movement, capturing the way light reflected off LA's glass towers at sunset, the way the neon signs pulsed like veins through the streets, the way a place that could be so lonely still somehow felt alive in his art. And yet, the truth was cruel. His art had no future. Not because he lacked talent. Not because he lacked heart. But because as soon as the sky opened up, as soon as a single drop of rain hit the pavement, as soon as a city worker with a pressure hose came by without a second thought, it would all be gone. The world wouldn't remember it. No one would stop to ask who had made it. No one would care. Until now. The low, unmistakable rumble of a car's engine rolled down the street, deep bass humming through the pavement, cutting through the noise of the city like a presence that couldn't be ignored. People barely noticed at first. Another expensive car in LA wasn't anything new. Another celebrity passing through wasn't worth looking up from their screens. But then, the car slowed. Slowed more than usual. Slowed until it stopped completely. And that made people start paying attention. Snoop Dogg had been in this city all his life. He had seen everything, been everywhere, met everyone. He had driven past thousands of artists trying to make it, past millions of people lost in their own struggles, past too many stories that never got told. But there was something about this moment. Something about this art. Something about this man. And for whatever reason, maybe fate, maybe instinct, maybe just the right moment at the right time, Snoop Dogg chose to stop. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't rushing to an event, to a meeting, to a show. And in that second, he did something that no one else had done all day, maybe all week, maybe for this man's entire life. He stepped out of his car. And he looked. The artist had spent years learning to tune out the world, to ignore the sound of footsteps passing too quickly, to pretend he didn't hear the whispers, the judgments, the way people dismissed him before even knowing his name. But this silence was different. Because when Snoop Dogg stopped, the whole street stopped with him. People who had been too busy suddenly weren't. The eyes that had been glued to phones were now locked onto this moment. A moment that wasn't planned. A moment that wasn't for cameras. A moment that was about to change everything. The artist was used to people looking through him, but this was different. This was a presence that demanded attention, a presence that had filled stadiums, a presence that had built a legacy, and yet, here it was, standing on the sidewalk, not in a VIP section, not on a stage, but right beside him. Snoop Dogg, in his laid-back swagger, shades covering his eyes, hands in his pockets, crouched down like he had nowhere else to be and took in the full scope of the masterpiece beneath him. Yo, man, this right here? This is fire. For a second, the artist thought he had imagined it. That couldn't have been meant for him. That couldn't have been real. Because when did the world ever stop for people like him? His throat was dry, the shock hitting faster than he could process, but he forced the words out anyway, barely above a whisper. You serious? Snoop nodded, his expression unreadable behind his shades, but his voice was as real as it got. Dead serious. You ever sell this kind of work? The artist almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Man, can't sell what don't last. He gestured toward the sidewalk. One rain and it's gone. And there it was, the reality of it all. The truth that no one wanted to say out loud. That some art, no matter how beautiful, was never meant to last. But Snoop wasn't about to let that happen. He had seen enough. He had felt enough. And he knew exactly what needed to happen next. Snoop reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and without hesitation, snapped a picture. Not just of the artwork, but of the man who made it. Because talent didn't disappear. People just didn't know where to look. And Snoop was about to make sure they did. The caption was simple, but it didn't need to be anything more than that. This man's got talent. Somebody get him off the sidewalk and into a studio. Who's down? And then, with one tap, he sent it to millions. Within minutes, his phone started blowing up. Retweets. Comments. Messages. And then, the real calls started coming in. For the first time in years, the artist wasn't invisible. For the first time in years, people were talking about his work before the rain could wash it away. The offers came in fast. A gallery downtown. A street art collective. A sneaker brand looking for its next limited edition design. And as the artist sat there, chalk still covering his hands, heart still pounding in his chest, mind still trying to catch up with reality, he realized something. He wasn't just another face in the crowd anymore. He wasn't just another man on the sidewalk. He was an artist. And now, the whole world knew it. For years, the artist had been used to being invisible, had learned to accept that people would walk past him without so much as a glance, that they would step over his artwork as if it were just another crack in the pavement, as if it had no more meaning than the gum stains and discarded wrappers that littered the streets of LA. He had stopped expecting people to notice, stopped expecting anyone to care, stopped hoping that someone, anyone, would take the time to stop and actually see what he was creating. But this was different. The moment Snoop Dogg spoke, the artist's hands froze mid-motion, a piece of blue chalk still clutched between his fingers, the dust from his latest stroke barely settled on the pavement. His heart pounded in his chest, not from excitement, not from fear, but from pure disbelief, because this wasn't just anyone standing in front of him. This was Snoop Dogg, a living legend, a name that had traveled across generations, a man who had built his career by speaking for those who weren't heard, by giving a voice to those who had been ignored, by proving that talent, no matter where it came from, deserved to be seen. And now, that same man was standing right there, looking at him, not through him. Yo, man, this right here? This is fire. The words hung in the air, so simple, so casual, yet carrying a weight that felt impossible to hold. The artist blinked, unsure if he had actually heard what he thought he had heard, if his exhausted mind was playing tricks on him, if maybe he had finally lost the last shred of reality he had been holding onto. Because people didn't stop for him. People didn't praise him. People didn't even see him. And yet, here was Snoop Dogg, crouching down beside him, studying the details of his work with genuine admiration, not the forced politeness that some strangers gave out of pity, not the condescending head nods that came with a few spare coins thrown his way, but real, honest respect. For the first time in years, someone was looking at his art the way he had always dreamed they would. His lips parted, his throat dry, his fingers tightening around the chalk as if grounding himself in reality, as if reminding himself that this moment was actually happening, that it wasn't some cruel dream that would disappear the second he blinked. You serious? His voice came out rough, hoarse from days without much conversation, from months of talking only to himself, from years of learning that words were useless if no one was listening. Snoop didn't hesitate. Dead serious. You ever sell this kind of work? The artist almost laughed, not out of joy, not out of amusement, but out of the sheer absurdity of the question, out of the impossibility of the idea. Sell it? How could he sell something that wasn't permanent? How could he sell something that could be erased with a single night's rain, something that a city worker with a hose could wipe away in seconds, something that had never been meant to last? He shook his head slowly, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Man can't sell what don't last. He gestured toward the pavement, toward the fragility of his existence, toward the reality that no matter how much he poured into his art, it would always disappear before it had the chance to be remembered. Snoop didn't argue. Didn't try to convince him otherwise. Didn't offer him false hope or empty words. He simply nodded, as if letting the truth settle, as if understanding the weight behind those words, because he had been there once too. He had known what it was like to feel like the world wasn't listening, to feel like your work could be erased before it had a chance to be seen, to feel like no matter how much you gave, it would never be enough to break through the noise. But Snoop had found a way to make people listen. And now, he was about to do the same for this man. Without another word, Snoop reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and in a single motion, snapped a picture. Not just of the artwork. Not just of the masterpiece that stretched across the sidewalk, but of the man who had created it. Because talent wasn't meant to be washed away. Because art wasn't meant to be forgotten. Because the world needed to see this. Snoop's fingers moved fast, his mind already working, already knowing exactly what needed to be said, exactly how to make sure that this moment didn't disappear like every masterpiece before it. He typed, "This man's got talent. Somebody get him off the sidewalk and into a studio. Who's down?" And then he hit post. And just like that, everything changed. It didn't take long. The post started blowing up within minutes, likes, shares, comments flooding in, each one carrying a ripple of momentum, each one spreading the image further, each one turning the artist's world from forgotten to the center of attention. People wanted to know who he was. People wanted to see more of his work. People wanted to help. And then, the real calls started coming in. Gallery owners. Street art collectors. Brands looking for fresh talent. The same people who wouldn't have spared him a second glance an hour ago were now desperately trying to reach him, trying to be the first to offer him a platform, trying to make sure that they didn't miss out on the artist that Snoop Dogg had just put on the map. The world that had ignored him was now scrambling to know his name. The artist sat there, still gripping a piece of chalk, his hands trembling not from exhaustion, not from hunger, not from the cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming realization that his life had just changed in a way he never saw coming. He wasn't just another nameless face in the crowd anymore. He wasn't just another man whose work would be washed away by the next rain. He was seen. He was valued. He was finally remembered. Snoop didn't have to stop that day. He didn't have to say anything. He didn't have to pull out his phone, didn't have to make a post, didn't have to take the time to change a stranger's life with nothing more than his presence and his voice. But he did. Because sometimes all it takes is for one person to see what everyone else has ignored. And in that moment, Snoop Dogg chose to see. And that choice changed everything. Snoop Dogg had made countless posts in his lifetime, platinum album announcements, shout-outs to young artists, collaborations with legends, moments that defined his career, but this post, the one he had just typed out and sent to millions of followers, felt different. There was no promotion, no marketing plan, no strategy behind it. Just a picture of a masterpiece that would have been forgotten and a man who had been ignored for too long. Just one sentence that could change everything. This man's got talent. Somebody get him off the sidewalk and into a studio. Who's down? And the second his thumb hit post, the internet exploded. It started as a trickle, a few hundred likes, then a few thousand, then tens of thousands. The comments flooded in at a pace so fast that they blurred together, people tagging gallery owners, street art collectors, brands, influencers, anyone who could make a difference. It wasn't just praise, it was momentum, an unstoppable wave growing bigger with each passing second, each share, each retweet. People who had walked past the artist that very morning without a second glance were now scrambling to figure out who he was, where he came from, how they could help. The same city that had ignored him for years was now obsessed with his work, desperate to see more, desperate to be a part of the story that Snoop had just set in motion. And then the real messages started coming in. It wasn't just fans hyping up the post anymore. It was art galleries. It was street art collectors. It was fashion brands looking for their next big collaboration. It was the kind of attention the artist had never even dared to dream about. One gallery owner from downtown LA slid into Snoop's DMs within minutes, asking for a name, a contact, anything. We need to find this guy, we need to showcase his work. Another message came from a sneaker company looking for a fresh, urban artist to design their next limited edition release, and they were already offering a contract. Snoop scrolled through the messages, smirking to himself, because he knew exactly what was happening. This was bigger than just a viral moment. This was a life-changing opportunity unfolding in real time. The artist had no idea. He was still sitting there on the cold pavement, his fingers covered in chalk dust, unaware that the world had just shifted beneath his feet, that his name was now being spoken in rooms where it had never been spoken before. He didn't own a phone. Didn't have Wi-Fi. Didn't have a way to see what was happening. To him, the world was exactly the same as it had been 5 minutes ago, except for one thing. Snoop Dogg was still standing there. Still watching him. Still giving him the kind of attention that no one else ever had. And then, with the same calm energy he always carried, Snoop crouched down beside him again and said the words that made his heart stop. "You about to be famous, homie." The artist blinked, looking at Snoop like he had just spoken in another language, like his brain was refusing to process what he had just heard. "What?" His voice cracked slightly, as if he had forgotten how to respond to something that wasn't rejection, dismissal, or indifference. Snoop grinned, pulling out his phone and tilting it so the artist could see the screen, the thousands of notifications, the hundreds of comments, the DMs from people who had spent their entire careers searching for raw talent like his. "I'm saying, the world finally seeing what you do, dog. And they ain't ever gonna forget it now." The artist stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat as he saw his own work staring back at him from phone screens around the world. His art. The same art that people had ignored. The same art that had been stepped on, washed away, forgotten over and over again. But now it was everywhere. The moment spread beyond social media, beyond the internet, beyond the screens of strangers who had never met him before. People started coming to see the artwork in person. Pedestrians who had walked past that street 1,000 times before were now stopping, pulling out their phones, taking pictures, leaving tips in a jar that had once been empty. A local news station caught wind of the story. Homeless artist goes viral after Snoop Dogg spotlights his work, and within hours, there were cameras, interviews, more reporters trying to piece together a life that had been invisible for too long. The artist sat on the pavement, still in shock, as his world got bigger and bigger by the second. And Snoop just watched it happen, like he had known all along that this was where things were meant to go. An unknown number rang on Snoop's phone, and when he answered, the voice on the other end wasted no time. "We want him in our gallery. This month. Whatever it takes." Snoop exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. "Y'all finally getting it now, huh?" The voice on the other end chuckled, but there was urgency behind it. "We do. And we don't want to miss out." Snoop smiled, because he already knew they had been missing out this whole time. The offers didn't stop. By the end of the day, 3 different galleries had reached out. A famous streetwear brand was offering to buy exclusive rights to one of his designs for their next drop. A nonprofit art collective wanted him to mentor young artists from struggling backgrounds. And for the first time in his life, the artist wasn't just hoping for a break, he was choosing between opportunities. As night fell over the city, the artist sat there, his hands still covered in chalk dust, staring at the street where everything had changed. And then, for the first time in years, he let himself smile. Not a small, fleeting one. A real smile. Because he finally understood. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't luck. This was his moment. And this time, it wasn't going to be washed away. Snoop didn't have to stop that day. Didn't have to pull out his phone. Didn't have to use his platform to change a stranger's life. But he did. Because sometimes, all it takes is for one person to see what everyone else ignored. And in that moment, Snoop Dogg chose to see. And now, the world was never going to forget. The artist had spent years expecting nothing, no kindness, no second chances, no miracles. His life had been built on days that blurred into each other, on the kind of survival that didn't allow room for hope, on the certainty that the world would always move on without noticing he was still there. So when Snoop Dogg's phone rang, when he answered with his usual laid-back "what's good," when the voice on the other end, crisp and professional, spoke the words that would rewrite everything, the artist didn't even realize they were talking about him. "We want him in our gallery. This month. Whatever it takes." Snoop smirked slightly, resting against his car, watching the artist who was still sitting on the sidewalk, still processing the whirlwind that had just torn through his life. "Y'all finally getting it now, huh?" The voice on the other end chuckled, but there was urgency in their tone, the kind of urgency that only came when people realized they had been sleeping on something great for too long. "We do. And we don't want to miss out." Snoop put his phone down and turned toward the artist, who was still staring at the ground, still holding a piece of chalk between his fingers like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. The world around him had changed, but his instincts hadn't caught up yet. His mind was still stuck in the years of rejection, still convinced that this was all some kind of joke. Some cruel trick life was playing on him before yanking it all away. "You hear that, homie?" Snoop finally said, voice low, steady. The artist blinked, slowly lifting his head, exhaustion and disbelief warring in his expression. "Hear what?" Snoop grinned, but this time, it wasn't just amusement, it was pride, respect, certainty. "That was a gallery. They want your work. In their space. On their walls. People about to pay real money for what you do." Silence. A deep breath. Then another. And then, a shaky laugh that didn't sound like laughter at all, but more like a man trying to remember how to believe in something good. The artist wanted to believe it, he really did, but belief wasn't easy when you had spent years being told that you weren't good enough, weren't valuable enough, weren't worthy of even being seen. This don't make sense, man," he muttered, shaking his head, fingers tightening around his own wrist like he was trying to hold himself together. Snoop just nodded, because he understood. "Yeah, I get it. You've been invisible so long, you think that's just the way it is. The artist swallowed hard, his body still tense, still coiled, still waiting for the moment when this all disappeared and he woke up back on the pavement, back to nothing. It don't work like that, though, Snoop continued, voice calm, unshakable. Not no more. Not today. And those words? They hit harder than anything else. The moment felt like a scene from a movie, the kind that shouldn't be real, the kind that belonged to someone else's life, not his. But when Snoop stretched out his hand, when he nodded toward the car waiting at the curb, when he simply said, "Come on, let's go see what's next," the artist did something he hadn't done in years. He stood up. Not just in the physical sense, but in the way that mattered. He stood up for himself. For his talent. For the first time believing that maybe, just maybe, he deserved this. And when he followed Snoop toward the car, he didn't look back at the sidewalk. Because he wasn't coming back to it. Snoop didn't take him straight to the gallery. He took him somewhere better. A studio, a real, professional studio, the kind of space where ideas were turned into reality, where walls weren't just barriers, but canvases waiting to be filled, where people created things that lasted. The artist stood frozen at the entrance, his breath caught in his throat, his mind struggling to process that he was actually inside a place like this, that people were expecting him, waiting for him, ready to help him bring his vision to life. "You ever painted on a real canvas?" Snoop asked. The artist swallowed. "Nah, man. Only sidewalks." Snoop chuckled, handing him a paintbrush. "Then it's time you leveled up." It felt strange, almost unnatural, dipping the brush into paint instead of dragging chalk against rough pavement. The smoothness of the canvas was something he had never experienced before. There were no cracks to work around, no dirt to get in the way, no rain waiting to erase his work. He hesitated. And then, he made the first stroke. And with that, everything changed. It wasn't just Snoop watching. The studio was filled with artists, photographers, producers, people who had been in the industry for years, people who had worked with the biggest names in the game. And now, they were watching him. Really watching him. Not with pity. Not with judgment. But with respect. Because talent speaks louder than words. And his talent? It was finally being heard. Before the session even ended, the artist had his first official contract sitting in front of him. A gallery deal. A commission job. A real future. He hesitated before picking up the pen, because it still didn't feel real. But when he finally signed his name, it was proof that he wasn't just a man on a sidewalk anymore. That night, as he sat in a motel room that Snoop had paid for, a real bed, a real roof, a real chance to breathe, he stared at his hands, at the paint stains on his fingers, at the papers on the table with his name on them, and for the first time in years, he let himself believe. Believe that he wasn't going back to that sidewalk. Believe that his art was going to last. Believe that he was worth this. Snoop Dogg didn't have to stop that day. Didn't have to say anything. Didn't have to pull out his phone, didn't have to call in favors, didn't have to take a stranger from forgotten to unstoppable in less than 24 hours. But he did. Because sometimes all it takes is for one person to see what everyone else ignored. And now, the world wasn't just looking. The world was never going to forget. The night of the exhibition came faster than the artist could have ever imagined. Just weeks ago, he had been sitting on a cold sidewalk, convinced that his work would always disappear beneath the footsteps of strangers. Now, he stood inside a high-end art gallery in downtown LA, surrounded by people who had come to see his work, to admire what they had once ignored. The walls were lined with his pieces, not chalk sketches on pavement, but real, framed paintings, preserved in a way that no rain could erase. Cameras flashed, collectors whispered, and offers rolled in, each one solidifying the fact that he was no longer just a man on the street, he was an artist, and the world finally knew it. Across the room, Snoop Dogg leaned against a pillar, watching with his signature grin. "Told you, homie. They see you now." And this time, the artist believed it. The exhibition wasn't just a one-time event. By the end of the night, several of his pieces had sold, with more commissions lined up for the months ahead. A well-known designer approached him with an idea, a collaboration that would take his art beyond galleries and put it on clothing, murals, even sneakers. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. And the best part? He wasn't the only one. Snoop made sure of it. Through his foundation, he helped the artist set up a program to teach art to underprivileged kids, giving them access to materials, mentorship, and opportunities that he never had. Because success wasn't just about making it out. It was about reaching back and pulling others up with you. Snoop Dogg had spent decades making music, building a legacy, changing the culture. But that day, he didn't need a microphone to change someone's life. He just needed to stop. To see what no one else saw. To remind the world that talent is everywhere, you just have to pay attention. And the artist? He never forgot where he started. But now, his work would never be washed away again.